Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, for international humanitarian law, and for the Jackson Center itself. During the course of this year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Robert H. Jackson Center. All of these milestones and our planning to celebrate and commemorate them naturally had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. And we realized, obviously, we can't just rest on our laurels. So it also sparked conversations regarding where are we going and how do we get there? And that's a little bit of the story behind how we got to our 2021 programming theme, The Work Left to Do. During this year, we will be convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human rights, and equity. We have structured our bi-monthly teas a little bit differently this year. So the first tea each month will lay the groundwork for that month's particular topic. And in March, we are looking at environmental justice. And the second tea each month, which this is geared to showcase those actively doing the work to close the gaps or face the challenges or to solve the problems. And we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family and friends and networks and seek out ways to make changes in your community. So today I am excited to be in conversation with Ann Rolfes, the director of the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. The Bucket Brigade's core partners are communities facing the brunt of pollution and illness in Louisiana. The Bucket Brigade has supported these fence-line communities in Louisiana for 20 years by providing technical support in the areas of media, air monitoring, organizing, cartography, accident research, and report writing. And the brigade, and this is my favorite part, also provides faith that we can win and a track record of doing so. And thank you so much for joining me for tea today.
Yeah, happy to be here, and thanks for the coffee, the tea mug.
Absolutely, you don't have to be drinking tea, although
No, I am drinking tea actually. I guess I can't show you, that would spill it, but it's true, I am drinking tea.
Perfect. Well, and I will join you in that. So one thing I think, just to set out, we had a little bit of technical difficulty last week. So
My fault.
Not at all. We're blaming the rainstorm. So we're going to record this and then premiere it. But someone from the Bucket Brigade will join us live to answer questions. So we're excited about that. That's a new venture for us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I want to start with what is probably the basic question, and that is, how do you define environmental justice?
Well, let me not answer your question right off the bat and tell you it's really an honor to participate. And of course, Justice Jackson is a hero. How can you not know about him? And he couldn't be a hero of anybody's. And so we appreciate the underscore of justice, right, in his life. And then also in the work that we do. I will tell you that when I first started to do this work in my home state, I'm from here, what really was most important to me was that idea of justice, because I had grown up in an oil town where there was so much wealth, and yet actually less than 100 miles away were communities that were losing their homes and their lives and their health to pollution. And so for me, environmental justice is very fundamentally that everybody should have the right to live and breathe and work and play without being assaulted by the environment in which they live. And of course, while that's not just everybody, you can't talk about environmental justice, without acknowledging that Black and brown communities bear an absolutely unequal burden of that pollution. And so here in Louisiana, the African-American population is a third of our citizens in the state. And yet if you go near a refinery, you find that over half of the people who live next to an oil refinery are African-American. And so there's a very much an unequal burden in this state of the Black community bearing the brunt of pollution. And it's really, it feels like very important work, and that's why it's easy to stay inspired.
That's perfect. And so, and this is a conversation that will be very familiar to our regular audiences, in that although we have broken each of these months into topics, there's inevitably some sort of intertwining amongst them, because justice is rarely just a single issue. And so that holistic view of it and that intersectionality of it is something that we need to talk about, because that absolutely informs the definition of justice and the work that is done under that word.
And what's really, upsetting here, and it is the reality, and yet just because it's happened forever doesn't mean that it's okay, is that you have, on the racial part of it, you have really the white powers that be. Not all of them are white who are letting this happen, but most of them are white. And so in a place like St. James Parish, where we're currently working, you have the parish council that has okayed the build out of significant number of petrochemical plants, right? There already are 12 there. They've given the green light for one of the world's largest plastics plants. And what are they doing? They're cramming it in the Black community. They're putting it in a district that is 90% Black. And then claiming that, oh, everybody in the parish wants it. Well, that's not true, right? The people who live exactly where it would be certainly don't want it. And so it's really chilling to see that some of these stereotypes of the Deep South are not just stereotypes, that it's actually, still happening. You'd think it was 1900 around here, by the way, that some of this stuff is still shaking out according to race. And again, it's important to expose it and to fight it.
Well, and you mentioned, let's take a step back, maybe 20 years or so, and let's talk about the founding of the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. You mentioned that Louisiana is your home state. And so what needs were you seeing in the community at the time? How did the Louisiana Bucket Brigade come to be?
Yeah, it really, the need that was there is the need that still exists today, which is this idea of putting huge petrochemical plants smack in the heart of Black communities. Real specifically, the time of our founding, I had just learned about the bucket, which were named after the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. The bucket is an air sampling device. And I learned about the bucket, and I was working at the time, just volunteering in communities with some of the women who lived along Cancer Alley. And I could see how people loved to be able to take an air sample and then have the results for themselves. If you think about what the usual dynamic is, usually, I'm sitting on the porch, maybe my kids are playing in the yard, we smell something terrible, we have to call the company, or we call the state Department of Environmental Quality. Well, those are two institutions that don't care about me and my family, right? In fact, we just don't exist as far as they're concerned. And so when I first learned about the bucket, I saw how it transformed that situation. No longer do I just have to call an institution that doesn't care about me. I can get in my yard and take my own air sample and document exactly what's in the air on that day. So I was really inspired by that tool. The women that I was working with at the time were also, and so we started the Bucket Brigade.
Okay, so part of what you said there really, I guess, sort of informs my next question, which is, these are partnerships, and these are communities working to both identify the problems and the challenges in their areas, and then also working towards solutions. So am I explaining that correctly? Okay, good.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And so one of the conversations we had with the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for our first conversation in March really focused on the concept of justice and what exactly does justice mean to someone. And what I found interesting from the NEJAC representatives was that justice in their mind needs to come from the communities. It can't be a top-down explanation of this will make things right. It has to be the community themselves surfacing the solutions, or what does justice actually mean to them? Does justice mean closing down the plant? Does justice mean imposing restrictions or regulations that change or I guess help protect or clean up the air. And so I wanted to talk to you about the work that the communities, and I have to imagine it varies by community, but what are some of the definitions of justice that the communities have come up with and are working towards or have worked towards?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, every human being should have agency over their own lives. And so if somebody walked into your house and said, this is how we're going to fix, your front steps, you probably wouldn't agree, you'd have maybe a different idea on how to do it. And so it certainly is the same thing in the communities that we partner with. And people's solutions have ranged according to the situation. So the first place I ever worked was in a place called St. Charles Parish, which is a county. A parish is our version of a county. And it was a neighborhood called Diamond. And in that situation, they felt as if the situation was so dire and they were so polluted by a shell chemical plant on one side of them and then a shell refinery on the other side of them. They were sandwiched between. That was the word people always used, were sandwiched between. They felt like they had to get out of there. And it was heartbreaking because it was a historic community. It's not just that people knew their neighbors, but their grandparents had lived next to each other and known each other. And they, before that, they had all been nearby on land that had been a plantation, and, their ancestors were connected. But the pollution was so bad that people were willing, or not just willing, but they were fighting to get out of there because they felt like their health was so compromised. So for the community of Diamond, that was a solution, was what they called relocation. And we worked together and achieved that. And then on the other end, today in St. James Parish, there's a community group called Rise St. James, and they are working, and other residents are as well, working tooth and nail to prevent a facility called Formosa Plastics from building, because they don't want to end up like Diamond did. They don't want to have so many plants around them that they'll have to leave their ancestral home. And in between those years, there have been people who just wanted a cessation on expansions. Others have wanted the state to install a robust air monitoring network. So you're right, there have been a variety of solutions. I will say now that we are really at a moment where people just don't want any more of this stuff built. And that has a much different feel to it than just sort of living with the situation that you're dealt.
Well, and so, one of the things that has occurred to me as we've been having these conversations this year is that a lot about what we talk about with regard to equity and justice really is, and this is not surprising, really is about addressing a power imbalance or a power differential. And because the environmental justice gap typically, as you mentioned, impacts communities of color or lower income or the indigenous populations of the area more severely, how do you go about, well, actually, maybe it's sort of a two-part question. How do you go about helping people see that there is a power imbalance or working with the communities to help them show people this? And then how does the work that that you're doing with the fence line communities then address that power imbalance?
Yeah, well, here in Louisiana, I'm going to just take notes because your question had a couple of points and I don't want to forget. Okay, hang on.
Yep.
So here in Louisiana, if you think if where we are is a lot of the communities that we collaborate with are right next to the Mississippi River. And if you think about, well, what used to be right next to the Mississippi River? Oh, it's plantations. And some of the facilities that are there today, the chemical plants and refineries, are actually in the same footprint as those plantations. They needed, the plantations and the chemical plants needed many of the same things. They needed a huge tract of land. They needed access to the river. And they both need a political situation and government that will facilitate abuse of the Black population. And so today it's putting these big plants right in the middle. So that power imbalance is pretty obvious because honestly, the same dynamics play out. But I will say, your question about how do you convince people that there's a power imbalance? Well, the communities certainly know it, but otherwise, our fight is not really elucidating for them the roots of the racism or the horrible racial dynamics at play. Our goal is to win. And so we want to actually show that we do have power and to right that power imbalance. So again, if you think about St. James Parish, Formosa Plastics came in trumpeting the fact that they were a $9.4 billion facility. Well, that certainly seems like a power imbalance. And yet we are very close to beating them. And so, you know, we have power. It's just a matter of using it strategically and getting more resources to build it up.
We talked a little bit, and my recollection is that the Bucket Brigade works with usually one community at a time, because these are fairly in-depth projects. And we had talked a little bit before our technical difficulties overwhelmed us last time about how the communities keep people focused on these issues. And then also, how do they keep up the momentum within their community, since these aren't projects that you can sort of see the end sight is 3 months from now. These are more, you know, years sometimes on what you're working.
Yeah, well, it takes a rare person to dig in and take on these battles, which are overwhelming, and they're really all consuming. You know, how many of us in our spare time, you know, go to meetings, talk with journalists, get on Zoom calls in every single second of our spare time? But that's what it takes in the communities where we're working for people to stand up together and beat these plants. And so, you know, in one sense, it's an existential need for survival that drives them to be engaged. And yet, you know, levels of political participation and levels of participation in civic engagement in general can be quite low. So a lot of people, more people aren't involved than are. And so what do you attribute this to? Faith, right? Some calling, the urgency of the injustice. You know, I think it really varies for every person. You know, I know for me, you know, we began with a conversation of justice. Just the deep, deep injustice of it is one of the things that keeps me engaged. Sharon Levine in St. James Parish, actually, I just spoke with her today. You know, for her, it is a calling. I mean, she actually heard God call her to do this work. And faith, when you're dealing with a huge company, a $9 billion company, faith is a huge component of this. You know, if you don't believe and know you can win, then it'll be a really long road. But when you have that faith, it feels a lot better.
And I want to talk a little bit about Cancer Alley. And so for those of us not familiar with Louisiana, can you give me sort of the geographic endpoints of that?
Yeah, so Cancer Alley is, again, Mississippi River is a very foundational idea down here. So Cancer Alley is the river, the Mississippi River, it's considered between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It actually does go a little bit further south to a smaller town, the smaller parish of St. Bernard, but it's about an 85 mile stretch of river that has almost 200 petrochemical plants there. And it's clearly, you know, there's been a decision made to just write this part of the world off and cram petrochemical plants there. I think what's chilling now is that there's so much happening with export. You know, it used to be, at least with oil, that everything we refined, or, you know, everything was for use in the country because that was the law. But during the Obama administration, the export ban was lifted by Congress, and he did not, unfortunately, veto it. And so now it means that there's this global bonanza, that if these companies can export the natural gas, the oil, any of it, and they are, you know, working to build and expand relentlessly here.
It doesn't.
And so Cancer Alley is going to, you know, is getting worse, not better.
I was gonna say, it doesn't seem as if 85 miles is a lot of, is certainly not a lengthy stretch. And you mentioned, I think there's a couple hundred chemical plants there already.
Yeah, yes. It's hard to know a precise number, but yes, that's right.
Okay. And so then, I guess I'm also curious as to where are these conversations taking place in terms of what justice would be? So are they at the local level, or are they with the city governments? Is it with the state government? Is it even broader than that? Do you actually take the conversation to the heads of the corporations themselves, or to people in Congress? I'm just curious as to sort of, and maybe it's all of those, but just curious,
Right.
sort of where are those conversations happening?
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting at the local level, the parish council, which would be your county council, a parish council in the case of St. James Parish is where some of these decisions are made. And what happens is that you have these 7 people, 6 men, 1 woman sitting up there, pretty impassive, but you have the community members in St. James Parish speaking really clearly about what justice is. And I will tell you that those are some of the most profound moments of my life, to watch these women stand up before this parish council that, in some case, one guy was on a cell phone, other guys looking down, somebody else might be sitting there, but are they feeling or hearing this? No. And these women are stating really clearly what justice is. I just want to say some of the names because I think it's important. Rita Cooper has been really involved. Sharon Levine leads Rise St. James. Gail LaBeouf, Barbara Washington, Myrtle Felton, Ophelia Williams. Those are just some of the names of the women. And then Pastor Harry Joseph has been there too. They've gone to meetings of the parish council, numerous meetings over 7, 10 years, and stood before this body and said very clearly what justice looks like. And justice does not look like cramming these petrochemical plants into the highest majority Black district of the parish, right? Justice is not deciding that you're going to give this crazy zoning category called residential future industrial only to the 2 highest majority Black districts in the parish. And so, it's a real contrast where you have this profound statements by the St. James residents, and then they're utterly blown off by the parish council. And I think what's always impressed me is that these residents continue to talk and continue to go there, even though really they're quite disrespected by the local government. So that's very vigorously where justice is spoken of. And now certainly we'll be going to the federal government a lot because, ironically, or not ironically, but it's kind of funny to think that we probably have a better chance to access and influence President Biden than we do our local government or even our state government.
And that's interesting. The residential future industrial, if I'm remembering that correctly,
yes,
seems to imply that they don't anticipate residents remaining there. Like their goal really is to remove the residents from these areas.
Thank you. That is really well put. Their goal is to remove the residents. And so it's quite manipulative. What they say is, oh, well, those areas of our parish are dwindling, right? The population is dying out. But what the parish does not acknowledge is that they're closing services. So they closed that. There was a cotton cooperative there that was closed. They closed the post office more recently, moved the high school, shut it down and moved it to a different part of the parish, shut down an evacuation route for one part of the district. And so they're actively killing off these 2 highest majority Black districts, actively killing them off. They're surrounding one of the parks, a playground, with a petrochemical plant, with a methanol plant. And then they want to say, oh, well, people are moving out. Nobody's coming in there because you're killing it, and that is, again, if you get to justice, that's really profound to see it happen. We know not even in the abstract, we can see that racism exists in so many different forms. And so to watch it now in 2021 take the form of this real manipulation of a land use map is both chilling and then an important reason to get to work.
Well, and you had mentioned that for a lot of these families, this is where their families have always lived. This is generations of their families have been on maybe not necessarily in these exact homes, but in this area, perhaps in some cases in that they're still in the family homes. And so that's, we had talked earlier about how there is this dichotomy of the argument of, well, people aren't moving in or people seem to be leaving. And maybe it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing. Is it that people are leaving because, or are you doing these things in order to have that self-fulfilling prophecy that now people are?
Yeah, it's the latter. They're purposely killing it off. yesterday I was in St. James and I was in the home of Barbara Washington, and she tells, when she speaks, she leads off with an amazing story. She lives on land. And how did she get that land? Her great, 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 great grandmother bought 34 acres of land in 1874, right? 9 years after the Civil War ended, somehow she managed to buy 34 acres of land, and that land has survived, been in the family, they've kept it through all the violence, over 150 years. And now what threatens it? Really? The world's largest plastics plant? I mean, or one of the world's largest plastics plant. I mean, whose side are you on? Barbara Washington or the plastics plant, right? I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer.
Well, and I feel like a lot of the conversation with regard to, let's call it industrialization, because that feels right for this, has to do with, these are going to bring jobs to the area. This is actually going to fuel the economy. And so wondered if you could speak to a little bit about what you're seeing in these communities and what these communities are experiencing, with that as the backdrop.
Yeah, it's very much, fueling whose economy off of whose back. So it's definitely true that there will be some jobs that somebody will get. It certainly won't be anybody from the 4th and 5th districts who will be hired. That's not the way these things ever turn out. They don't get the jobs. And in fact, in one of our battles in St. James Parish, they were touting this local jobs nonsense, and they would say, the average salary is going to be, $900,000. I'm exaggerating, but this is, they're like that.
I was going to say, wait, all of a sudden I'm in the wrong.
I know. And then of course we say, well, yeah, what's the mean salary? They have all these sort of these tricks to manipulate information. And then this great colleague of mine, her name is Kim Terrell from the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. She went and found some of the job ads and found that a requirement for these jobs, for some of the jobs, was going to be to speak Mandarin. All right. Well, how many people from St. James Parish do you think they were going to be hiring if it was a job requirement to speak Mandarin? So the job argument is not a true one for local people. And I will say that when there was a pipeline being rammed through St. James Parish, it was called the Bayou Bridge Pipeline. We were going to the construction site, and you'd see license plates from everywhere else but Louisiana. You'd see Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, Arkansas. And then I even saw Utah plates, but never Louisiana. And, that just speaks to this really twisted tale they're telling when our governor gets out there and touts the construction jobs, and even gives them tax breaks, right? Based on the number of jobs they'll provide. And yet there's no follow through to find out who's getting these jobs. And, it's of course important for us not to pit worker against ourselves, right? We're glad somebody's getting a job. They just needs to be a job at a solar panel factory, or installing wind turbines, right? Or weatherizing homes. It should not be creating a big toxic facility that's going to kill people and destroy their homes.
Okay. Well, and you have mentioned a couple of partners that you have worked with as well. And so I want to talk about the importance of partnership. All of these organizations that we have been so fortunate to speak with this year and last year are obviously tackling a particular problem, or in some instances, perhaps a few problems, but no one organization can tackle everything. So talk to us about the partnerships that you have, or the fence line communities have, and how important those are to advancing this.
Yeah, well, you could do this work from all sorts of different angles. You could be in the legislature trying to pass policy, which would actually be wonderful. You could be at the federal level doing lobbying. You could be a scientist getting in there and really understanding the emissions and kind of whipping people up that way. And so it's just a matter of how you come at it. I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa. I then went and worked, you can see behind me, this is Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a Nigerian leader. My career always really began by working alongside communities most impacted. And so in Louisiana, when we started the Bucket Brigade, that's just how it went. And so our core partners are groups like Rise St. James, Inclusive Louisiana, and in the past, groups like Residents for Air Neutralization, one of my favorite names, and then Concerned Citizens of Norco. It's always been these groups based in the communities where the harm is happening. And then of course there are other NGO partners, but those community partnerships are really the soul of what we do.
Do you, I want to sort of be clear too, going back to our sort of top-down approach versus servicing from the community. Do the communities come to you? Are they looking for, hey, we have this challenge and we need someone to help us navigate this? Or is it that the Bucket Brigade is looking for communities where they might be able to help?
Yeah, we're not that big, right? So we, at some point, maybe we can be deep in some of these more than one fight at a time. But right now, oh, sorry, that's hang on, let me just get rid of that.
No worries.
Apologize. Sorry, you warned me about that. I think it's cordless. All right, well, there's nothing I can do about it.
No worries.
So when we're working with a community, we're, we go there every, a couple times a week, on the phone all the time. My coworker was just on the phone with somebody trying to make sure they can get Word installed on the laptop that they have, that kind of detailed work. We, at the beginning of the pandemic, trained everybody on how to get on Zoom, make sure everybody had a cell phone or a computer where they could, so that people could remain engaged. And if you're taking on a $9 billion company like Formosa, or project like Formosa, you've got to really keep things moving. And so it's incredibly intense for us when we're involved in a battle. And so we usually have one, deep partner at a time. And then we're helping some other people a little bit, but just one deeply at a time. And so it has always happened that one partner comes from the prior one. So for example, when we were working in Diamond, in the neighborhood I described at the outset, some people from the neighboring town of New Sarpy would come because they were also having trouble with the refinery. And so then we after we were done in Diamond, we went down to New Sarpy. And then a few years later, I got a call from people in St. Rose. Well, they had gotten my number from Margie Richard, who led the group in Diamond. And it's that kind of thing. I just called a man this morning who was asking us for help with a new facility that's planned for his neighborhood. So there's a lot happening here, and there's no shortage, unfortunately, of work that where we're called in to help.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to what you were describing about one of the early communities. I think it was the Diamond community. So the one that ended up being relocated.
Yes.
What does that actually mean? Like, what all does that entail? And I'm thinking, is it partially who funds the relocation? So is it they're trying to move to another particular community, or is it at that point dispersal to wherever they can go? And how does that logistically work?
Yeah, I mean, buyouts happen in various scenarios. This one Shell paid for, and that was our battle to get them to pay for it. In South Louisiana, where the communities are sinking into the ocean because of human-caused climate change, it's actually the government that's paying to relocate people who are flooding all the time. But in the case of Diamond, we fought hard to get it so that people would get enough and then not have to go and have a mortgage, because the company wants to say, oh, we'll pay you fair market value, which sounds really great, doesn't it? But oh yeah, by the way, you've totally devalued my property, so now my house is worth $10,000. And so we had to cut through this nonsense about fair market value and get to a floor below which they wouldn't go. And yet, most people in that neighborhood took the deal. Some people stayed. But, one of the real issues here, and this is kind of getting off in a different direction, is that when you have property that's been handed down through generations, sometimes the titles aren't clear, the paperwork hasn't been done, or, maybe my grandmother passed down this house and now me and my 3 siblings are living in it. And now there's a buyout, and each of us is getting enough, for a fourth of a house, and we don't want to all go buy a house and live together again. But anyway, it's complicated, and a lot of times the structures aren't created to deal with those complications, and they somehow cast aspersions on those situations when those are family, profound family situations that should be honored and actually, valued monetarily. So in the case of Diamond, Shell paid. But it can differ depending on the scenario.
Want to talk a little bit too. We have a lot of conversations here at the Jackson Center about civics and about civic engagement. And it strikes me that, and this actually may be sort of a gross stereotype, that typically lower income populations, African-American populations, indigenous populations are less well-versed in civic engagement. So how do you work with them to enhance those skills? Is it teaching them how to advocate for themselves? Is it really just helping them find the platforms or find the people with whom to speak? Because as you have mentioned, and I have no doubt about this, their stories are compelling. So it's not so much needing to tell them what to say. So is it more navigating
Yeah,
the process?
I have found that the opposite of what you're saying is true. That the communities that I've worked with, you know, some have been white, some have been black and white, and mostly they've been African American. But they are more civically engaged than any community I've ever lived in, because they have to be, right? They're getting run over by government at every level. You know, look no farther than Georgia, which is the example playing out before us all, right? Amazing civic engagement there. And yet look at the overwhelming response by the state. And so in my case, it's just, you know, the example of Pastor Joseph and all the women who were going to the council to testify. You know, they've been doing that work for a long before I ever showed up. And so in our case, it's just a matter of amplifying that a little bit, right? And figuring out, okay, well, what is it that you are doing? And, oh, can we get a good lawyer with you who might help you out, or, you know, find any other technical resource. An urban planner and a cartographer helped us really pull apart the really racist land use plan that the parish has. So it's just adding a bit of muscle and amplification to people who already have an amazing analysis and who are already quite engaged. Unfortunately, I mean, it's too bad they have to be engaged, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned in a lot of the language about the Bucket Brigade too also talks about media and how important the media is.
Yeah.
So I also would love for you to speak a little bit about, you know, how that plays out. Why is that so important that the media be involved?
Yeah, well, I'm just writing down to remember. Well, so it's not as if any situation could be as successful as the community leaders in Louisiana have been in getting media. You know, you could try to get attention for a lot of matters, but it wouldn't get coverage. But in this case, you do have people who have a pretty profound analysis of the situation, and they're great spokespeople. I mean, if you think about the South and what are some of the stereotypes about us, it would be that we're good storytellers, or that there's some sort of character, you know, it's kind of interesting characters around here. And that's all true in the communities that we collaborate with. And so you put these great storytellers in front of the camera, well, you know, that's pretty compelling. And for us, media is really important because it's a way to get a story out to a larger universe. You know, as an example, you know, on the one hand, media did us a real disservice last week because the local paper editorialized pretty vociferously against the work in St. James, and even, you know, put the words, if you can imagine, put the words environmental justice in quotation marks, as if it's not a real thing, right? As if it's not an established field of scholarship, right, for half a century. And so that was a pretty, you know, that was terrible. The whole editorial was terrible. And so media, different media from outside our state is really important, right? I mean, in the same way that you needed the cameras on the dogs attacking the youth who were fighting to vote, right, in the South in the 60s, right? For the very same reasons, we need attention here, because the local abuse, as exhibited by our own local paper, is very stark. And if left unattended, simply leaves these communities to die by pollution, to just rot and die on the vine.
All right, I have one last question before we get to our lightning round.
Yes.
What do you wish, well, actually, sorry, I have two last questions. What do you wish people were paying more attention to?
You know, I think the real, I keep harping on the racial dynamic here because it's very important. And I think it's easy to sort of understand that racism happens. And, you know, the George Floyd trial that's happened, excuse me, no, the murder of George Floyd and the trial of the officer who killed him is happening. And we understand in that, or we have some sense of the injustice that happened there. In this case, what is facilitating the injustice toward the Black community is both the local attitudes of people, but then the way those attitudes were put into place by a land use plan. And so I will say that there is a document in St. James Parish that is actually a document that details how to racially cleanse the parish. And I don't say that lightly. It's kind of an intense thing to say, but it's true. And so, I would encourage people to go on our website and read this report we wrote called A Plan Without People, but also in their own communities, to find out what is the mechanism behind how the racism is happening, because it's not just that we all have an implicit bias, or that people are racist, or that the Klan is happening in pockets and places. It's that there are actual implementation mechanisms, and so we all need to understand what those are.
Okay. All right. Then my second question before the lightning round is, what?
That wasn't a very lightning round, was it? I'll be more lightning.
We'll get lightning. What would you like either your legacy or the Bucket Brigade's legacy to be?
That's a good question. I want our legacy to be that there is a much stronger movement from Cancer Alley itself and from people who live on Cancer Alley, so that they have groups that are well funded. They can make a living, just as I have all these years, doing this work to protect their communities from industry. And we're working hard. Our grants manager, is working with groups to raise money and to make sure that people can develop their organizations to do that.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay. Lightning round.
Okay. Really lightning now. Okay.
What progress do you hope to see in the next year?
We kill Formosa Plastics and enact a moratorium on any new facilities in St. James Parish.
Okay. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
Well, I work with some amazing people. So it's the community members that I work with. They have vision and they have faith, and nobody can beat us.
Okay. Who else is doing good work to make progress in this area?
Well, there's a group based in New York that has a great lawyer here in Louisiana. It's called the Center for Constitutional Rights. They are coming at this very much from a justice angle, and so they're doing wonderful work. State-based groups are Together Louisiana and the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, just to name a couple.
Okay, perfect. And then final lightning round question is, what would you suggest for our audience to be reading, to be listening to? Whose voices should they be exploring?
I'm very interested in Black history, and I mean, it works out well because it's important for me to be informed in our work and in what's happening today in the field of, attempts to strip people's rights and so forth. So for a book, I would recommend a book called White Rage by an amazing professor named Carol Anderson. And she just very much details how every advance, as we've seen in Florida and Georgia, is met with just this crushing response, just crushing. So that's what I would recommend to read, White Rage. And I listened to a podcast by two people who describe themselves as two Black culture writers from the New York Times. It's called Still Processing. And I learn a lot every time I listen to that. And for me, I think in general, it's important, but for me in my work as a white person doing this work, it's really important for me to be led by people who can teach me and help some of my own biases fall away.
Okay. All right. So I'd like to thank our audience for joining us for tea today. A quick programming note: April will be economic or poverty justice. That will be the topic that we'll be looking at in April. And so our next tea will be on Thursday, April 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Our guest will be Audra Wilson. She is the president and CEO of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. The Shriver Center has been doing this work for more than 50 years. And so excited to talk to someone with that breadth and depth of experience in this. And Anne, I really want to thank you so much for sharing the work of the Louisiana Bucket Brigade and certainly being with us and challenging us. We know these conversations never really end. So we have a lot of work that we need to keep doing. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be on this program. Thank you.